Our challenge is to do some direct modeling from our reference photograph. Now, I still use the skull, generic skull, as the foundation, but of course, this skull isn't the same as this man's structure. He has low cheekbones, he has a narrow jaw. We have to interpret this skull to meet his design. So we're going to take our cutting tool and our grinding implements and do some work on this skull. Here is the skull. I've been paring it down to fit what I see by eyesight to be the structure of the model in the photograph. I've cut off the back, I've hollowed out the skull from the main part, and I'm also cutting away the inside of the eye chamber so that it will accommodate the eyeball. You want to be cautious with this, that you don't push all the way through the face. You will then break the line of the outside of the skull. The inside of the skull is what we're removing. We don't want to remove the outside if we can avoid it. This is where your handheld burr drill arrangement will come in handy. And we want to true up these eye openings a little bit from side to side, see if we can balance those. You can see on the profile, his cheekbone does not stand out here. So we want to make sure that the cheekbone of the skull that we're making for him doesn't stand out there. And he has fairly narrow space between the base of the nose on either side of the top of his teeth. So we want to narrow that down a little. Because once we put the clay over this, we can only go in so far as the plaster skull allows us. We want to get all the bone well back from the clay area, if that's understandable. We can see his head generally, but we don't know how narrow his frontal bone is. So we're going to take a little of that down just in case. But we have to do the same thing on each side. Using your eyes as measuring tools is the only way I know to do this. If he were standing here in front of us, we could use some sort of a caliper and measure point to point, and then measure a quarter of that for our skull. But he's not here. We have to use this photograph. It's a poor substitute. The best you'll generally have if you work from models, then that's going to help. Live models, I mean. When we look at his profile, we see his nose is fairly deep from the inside of the eye to the bridge of the nose. It's a good bridge. It doesn't sink way in. Now the bridge on this skull looks to come out a little too sharply here, so we're going to take slightly off the tip of it. Remember, the clay will make up for anything we overstate in our carving. Always referring to the picture all the time. Trying to look at the proportions and judge where they will be different from when you get clay on this, how you'll need to have the shape underneath coordinated. It's a nice thing about making a skull, you can carve it, made out of plaster that you can carve easily. And I think we've gone about as far as we can with this. Well, our next step is to cover this with clay. And here's our clay. Now if the clay is a bit damp, which this is, I sometimes take what I'm going to use immediately and dry it between two nice pieces of dry plaster just to get some of the water out of it. Doesn't take much. Handling it with your fingers takes a lot of water out of this paper clay. This is just an easy way to get started so you can proceed. Well, I think we've got enough moisture out of there so we can go ahead and apply it to the skull. I'm going to make a sheet like a pancake or a tortilla out of this. Now I'm going to put some glue on the surface of the skull. We want our clay to be well adhered to the skull. And our first concern is the face itself, not so much the back of the head or the neck. So we try to get our glue, not in running rivers of it, but just thoroughly over the front of the face of the skull, under the chin and all. I always keep a water jar handy so that I can clear my fingers of anything that's sticky that I don't want too much of. And now we're going to take our pancake of clay and obviously we're going to put it on the surface of the skull. If this is too soft, it'll be hard to do all the modeling you want to do in the first phase, so if it's a little bit dryish, it's not a bad idea. We're always referring to our photograph of our model because is his forehead bulging, is it slanting, is it straight up and down, whatever it is, we want to make sure that that's incorporated in our first modeling. The bigger structures of the face have to be dealt with first. The smaller structures come later, the eye forms and the nose and the mouth and all of that. But if we don't get the big structure straight to begin with, we're in bad shape. I'm going to put a little on the neck here because his neck is almost as wide as his ears from ear to ear, but not quite. He's still awfully young for that. The more you handle it, the drier this will become, and it'll be easier to handle further on. Now, one thing we have to do fairly early on in our project is to set the eyes in. This is one of my favorite tools to work with. So we're going to identify the eye hole. We've already done that. The skull is there. It isn't going to let you do much except go where the holes are. That's the benefit of having a superstructure under your work. If you were doing this with a wad of clay, at least in my view, you'd have a much more difficult time. And you can go in from the back because we've hollowed it out. Make that clay adhere to the inside of the skull as well as the outside. Years ago, when I decided that modeled eyes were not as good as eyes that were actual balls of some sort set into the face, I began to use porcelain beads. They were the right size, 8 millimeters in diameter, and they were white, of course, and they had the pierced hole as a bead. And so I'm going to use them in this case, and this is the tool I use to adjust them. A little stake with a needle sort of end. I'm just going to plant them gently into the front till we get everything set. And this helps you align the eyes. You can't, if you twist your ball, you'll know that you're cockeyed. So you keep the thing lined up with the needle. Now we can see from our photographs that his eyes are set fairly well back in his face. So we can push on those eyes somewhat. And I think that now is the time to put some backing clay in behind them. I don't know if you can see down in there, but we're going to drop a ball of clay and tamp it into place from the back so that we won't push them all the way into the skull and they fall inside and we have to start over again. And setting eyes is, I learned from Mattel artists, quite a science. We don't have the machinery they have, but we have some of the theory that they have available to us. And because the eyes are fairly well back in the skull, we want to push them well inside and then begin to work around that. The eyes are the first thing to deal with. They have to be balanced. They have to be looking the same direction. They have to be the same distance from the center, the bridge of the nose to the eye. The pupil of the eye has to be the same distance on either side. You don't want your image to be gaga simply because you didn't get these measurements corrected when you started out. You're a long way from worrying about a clear likeness. The likeness will take a lot more time to develop. It takes me about a week every day of working to get a good likeness. Now, some people are very quick on getting likeness. That's wonderful. They're very accomplished or they're very gifted in that respect. I'm not particularly. It takes me a long time. So if this doesn't look exactly like our photograph, remember I'm giving you a demonstration in direct modeling, not necessarily in perfect portraiture. But your goal is to make a perfect portrait if you're using a model. Of course, if you're just winging it from your imagination, you can do anything and get away with it, but I don't consider that necessarily your best effort. The best effort is to try to work from an existing image. And I think for people who are learning techniques of sculpture and modeling, it's a good idea to pick images that are not easy for them. The hardest image for me is a child or a very young woman without blemish or a very young man. This young man is fairly unblemished, so these are challenge images in my view. Doing old craggy men and women, that's like the ivy covering the bad architecture of an architect. You can cover your bad sculpture with wrinkles and character marks and all that business. The challenge is to see what you can do with something that really requires you to do something very simple, very direct. We're looking at the portrait, and we see that the front of the forehead is fairly evident above the bridge of the nose. And foreheads are not flat. They slant out. They slant out from the center of the skull. Center front, the frontal lobe is bulbous to some degree. It's a good idea to find your cheekbone alignment. The photograph is fairly clear from the planes of light on his face where his cheekbone. Identify that with our basic modeling here. Make sure we have that in the right place. Well, we've been moving along here with this and getting a little closer to our image, but we have a long way to go. It's constantly looking at the picture, constantly referring to the photographs, your reference material, constantly worrying about the balance, making sure that the nostrils are balanced and that the ears, when we get to them, are balanced. We'll see them in a minute. Of course, the eyes are always a challenge for any sculptor or modeler. He has a heavy eye fold, and that's a bit of a challenge to get the upper eyelid distinctive from the eye fold. This is the fold that comes up here, but the eye lid is under it. And we don't want to lose the lid, but we do want to emphasize the fold without making him look like an Asian face. This one seems to be more resistant to the shape we want. It helps to have the pupil of the eye. Now, if you were using blown glass eyes, you can still see the pupils. Very definitely not still see, but they are there. They are part of the glass eye. It's the piercing in the bead here that gives you the pupil and the direction of the eye. I think we want to regulate that a little bit. No matter what kind of an eye it is, if the pupil isn't free to see out under or beyond the lids, it can't see. The eye cannot function. So no matter how closed the eye is or how low the brow, the pupil has to be revealed to the outside, otherwise the eye is not functioning. So that just this little pupil hole here is our guide, we hope, going to be the craft of getting it to look like the model somehow. And you'll notice in the model's photograph there's a bit of a swelling under the eye. This is very subtle. You don't want to make it too much, or it looks like he has health problems or been weeping or something. Just enough so that you duplicate what nature gave the young man. And his eyes are, the bottom half of the iris is pretty well clear, so you see it. I've started on the mouth. Just got a rough outline of the mouth. And I always keep a brush and water handy, so you don't want to drown it like I just did, but you need to smooth your work as going along with paper clay. That's one thing you cannot do with that rubberized Sculpting stuff. You can dissolve it with acetone, I've noticed. That's sort of toxic to work around. I always use something like that, but with water, much more environmentally friendly. It's about time that we let this dry a while before we go any further, because the clay is soft and has a tendency to muck up if you're being too busy with it. You can spoil your sculpture with just a stroke. We have to get in there to next to the nose with this movement here. That's why you need a tool that has a round end to it. we've pretty well got the nose line not too far from what nature has given him here. I think we need to extend the tip of it so a little bit. The way I see it, his nose comes down just a little bit at the tip. It's always fun and more gratifying in some ways to have a face with extreme features, but my feeling is that it's a greater challenge to try something without extreme features. I can't do children worth a darn. They're the hardest thing in the world as babies or infants. A sculptor like Martha Armstrong Hand was a virtuoso with children, and there are others who have those abilities. I'm not one of them. So for me, the hardest thing to do as a test would be to do a child's head. Mine always look like potatoes, sick potatoes, potato famine potatoes. Their eyes always look sinister. No, that wasn't my talent. I should have had to practice doing children and nothing else. And maybe I'd have achieved a better result with old men, or whatever it is, old women. The old masters used to make their students do the hardest thing that the student found to do. Hardest thing, had to do it over and over and over and over and over. Of course, I don't know what it did to everybody's sanity, but it certainly made the students proficient. I don't know what art school does for people today. I haven't been in an art school for 100 years, so I'm sure they're very difficult and demanding. But the idea of making the apprentice do something very difficult over and over hundreds of times doesn't sound very appealing, certainly not in today's culture. But when you look at the product of those apprentices when they became masters in their own right, you say, oh well, how do you suppose they ever did that? With practice is how they did it. I think this is as far as we'll go for a moment. Well, now that we've roughed the face out, we have a rough likeness, and I mean rough. But first of all, now that it's dry, we want to sand down some of the surfaces with clean sandpaper. A water-based clay, which paper clay is, doesn't have much shrinkage. This particular water-based clay. Some clays, if they're water-based, will shrink quite a lot, but this doesn't have much shrinkage. But there are areas, there are circumstances where there's a slight contour change when it's dried in the oven, and that can be corrected. The nice thing about paper clay, one of the many things, is that you can add on to it easily, and you see it's easily sanded. This is a very valuable aspect to it, where you can't do that with polyform clays very easily. See how nicely that smooths up. And also you can do the same thing with brush and water. Once we've done this, we can go over it with a brush and water and even make it smoother. Also, it would add a slight glaze to the surface so it isn't so powdery. But we don't want to be too exciting in the middle here, because that's where our features are. We don't want to erase them in our urgency. This is not a fine-grade sandpaper I'm using. I would suggest that you use garnet paper for anything like what I'm doing at the moment. It comes from Canada. It's hard to find. Very fine grit and does beautiful finishing work. It's designed for wood, of course. All we're doing is just touching areas where we see an inordinate amount of roughness. I marvel at these folk who can take their polyform clay and get just the exact form they want in their modeling before they put it in the oven and vulcanize it. And it's just what they want. I think that's remarkable. I don't have that gift. I have to go at things in phases. and rework things. It's as with a portrait painter in oil. Some people can get a perfectly wonderful likeness at the first sitting. I could never do that. I could eventually get a likeness, but I had to work at it a very long time. So even though this may not be the identical likeness that we're after at this point, remember we're working here under duress to get things to demonstrate a process. We're not demonstrating artistry, we're demonstrating a process. But this is the process that we'd go about and which we will be going about in direct modeling. Another tool that I've always found useful is a riffle. This is a very small riffle curve, absolutely essential. And I don't know where you get them except from a jeweler's supply place. But it does cut this clay and smooths it down nicely. The first coat of color, which, as I will if I haven't already point out, sometimes goes on with a brush rather than directly to the airbrush. And that will tell you where all of your lumps and bumps are and you need to correct. You can correct it right after that, right over the paint. The area along the edge of the eye wants to be nice and thin against the eyeball. It doesn't want to stick out too much. It's with the lashes, it's hard to tell, but here's the surface of the cornea, and right under it is the edge of the eye, and right below it is this little pouch of flesh, which is characteristic of many faces. This is really not a carving tool, so we better go to a carving tool. We're just working our way along the opening of the lips. We're right against the plaster skull, so it doesn't cut in very deep. The clay is very close to it, as it should be. The skin is fairly thin over the teeth in real life. Out here it's fleshy. The bones are way inside. Another plus about paper clay is that you can push it in and make a dent in it. You see the dent, little dent that this created? Doesn't matter here on the scalp. We're going to do other things with the scalp. See the little dent? It has a bit of give to it. That's very helpful because that way you can help model and finish your surfaces by burnishing them. This man's eye fold comes down past the lower lid a little bit. When we get further along with the sculpture, with the painting and the color and all of this, we'll find out if we want to add some clay in here. We may do. The sound you hear is my tool grating against the porcelain eyeball. It's not chirping. Cleaning out the edges of the eyelids. Here is this little indentation at the inner edge of the eye. You want them to be on the same level. You don't want them to be one up and one down. I'm going to attempt the same thing that I did in the other eyes, to demark the eyelid from the eye fold. Now with the glass eyes, the contour of the eyeball will be a little more realistic because the contour of the eyeball is not round. It comes out, the corneal bulge comes out as a point over the pupil, and that pushes the eye out, makes it seem to push forward in the face a little bit, which the porcelain beads don't provide. gently pushing the lower lid down slightly. He has more in the photograph. His eye dips down at the underside of the eye and is more straight across the top of the eye. I know they're both rounding, but still, it's more rounding. And the bottom of his iris is closer to the edge of the eyelid than the top of the iris is to the upper lid. So we're going to try to suggest that. How successfully it remains to be seen. I'm doing a lot of pushing with this rounded implement, and if your superstructure is where it should be, disaster will not follow. It's time to open up those nostrils, however. It's a good idea to hang on to the top of the nose when you're doing this. You don't want to flip the whole thing off. Well, of course, if you do, you can glue it back on, but that's not exactly an ideal approach. Nostrils are very complex. They're not just two holes under the end of the nose, and the shape of the nostril is part of the beauty or lack thereof of any face. In fact, the nose is such a beautiful feature in general. I'm an advocate of large noses. I don't think little puggy noses are particularly beautiful, which makes me conflict with current fashion, I suppose. Not that I would want to see a Durante nose on my favorite lady, but that isn't the point. Women with predominant beautifully arched noses are quite handsome. The French women are famous for their noses. Retoussé nose, which dips toward the tip, was considered very fashionable in the 18th century. A more aquiline nose is considered quite acceptable now, as long as it's narrow. The division of the lip at the top is important. And going around the lip to emphasize that little ridge of flesh that surrounds the lips, if it's there, it's useful to try to see how there's a little ridge underneath there. Try to emphasize that just slightly. When you apply the color, whether it's a brush or airbrush, you will lose some of the detail, but the blending of the paint will be an asset overall. A little sound is the actual scratching or scraping of the steel tool against the clay. Means you have a nice contact. I noticed in our photograph that the nostril is defined by the back edge of it. It isn't just a blend from the flesh of the nose into the flesh of the cheek. There's a defined mark around the edge of the nostril. So we're going to try to keep that. Well, let's try and put on the ears. I think we're at a point where ears would be appropriate, and then we can go from there to the neck and back of the head. But in order to put the ears on, we need to know where they're going to go. In order to place the ear, we want to figure out where on the face it goes, and let's say on average, from the pupil to the bottom of the chin is from the pupil to the middle of the ear. Call that the middle of the ear. Maybe you call that the middle of the ear, but let's say there. So we adjust our dividers accordingly to our scale here, and we say that from the chin to the pupil is about from here back to there. We make a mark, and looking down on it, we can see that that mark is here, very close to, and the ear is on a level with the edge of his brow as it comes down. So the edge of his brow is here. So the top of the ear would be here. So our area that we're going to carve out for the ear is in that area. And we're going to carve it out with our favorite tool, the grinder. You notice I blended a little bit by coming over the edge of it. We don't want a sharp pit. This is a concavity. I didn't even use the sandpaper. That's a good thing. Also want to remember the ear is set into the skull. It doesn't stick out on the promontory of the skull. I'm going to use the ear mold. A little bit of talcum powder. And a small amount of clay in each one. This is the press mold. You can make your own ears if you want to each time. After 30 years of doing it, I thought, well, this is ridiculous. The ears are all similar in structure. There are lots of individual qualities about each ear, but similar in structure. So if you want to do it with some less rigorous facility, then I use a press mold. And you can doctor them up later on to make the earlobes droop or whatever it is that you think is so special. And these want to pop right out, so let's make sure they're popping. This one doesn't want to pop completely. It needs a little bit of powder to pop. If your clay is too damp, press molds, paper clay. If the paper clay is too damp, it doesn't work too well with the press mold. So you have to make sure it's just stiff but not crumbly. A good impression, but it seems awfully sticky. I don't know why. Putting a little bit of glue in our ear cavity, not too much. And picking up the correct ear, you don't want to get it back to front. Put it in there. You have to use your eyes. This may not work the first time you do it. It doesn't always work for me all these times I've done it, but still it works eventually. Now that's one ear almost in place. Now we're going to go back. We're not going to trim it yet. Put a little bit of cement in the basin there. Pick up the other ear and put it on, pushing nice and firm. The trick is to get them so that they are the same level. They're very close to the same level. But let's clean off the mold before we try to adjust it. Make sure that we don't muck it up too badly. And I think it needs to be moved up just a little bit. Now, are they the same distance back from one another? They seem to be. And are they the same level? They seem to be. Now let's trim off the excess clay. Now instead of using a hard tool to go around and finish those edges that we've made, let's use a brush and just go around with a brush and melt that clay together with the head. As I keep saying, any terrible blunders can be corrected, but the basic process is as we have just demonstrated. This produces a credible ear. And I don't want to hear any chirping about how everybody's got different kinds of ears. Of course they do, but they're not that different. Every nose on the planet is structurally the same. Nature makes it that way. In the idiosyncratic nature of race and circumstance may change the overall appearance, but still no. Now we have the ears. While we have the head in our hands, let's close up the back. We no longer need the head open because we've adjusted the eyes. The eyes are cemented in place. For all intents and purposes, they're not going to move. So we're just going to drop the back in place. Being careful, very careful, not to touch our freshly modeled ears and lay in a little bit of clay around the edges. This is not terribly critical because if you're going to put hair on the head, it'll cover all of this. But you want the contour of the head to be correct. And right now, it's not totally correct. The back of the skull needs to be raised some. This figure has a dolichocephalic head, which means it's a long skull. The brachiocephalic has a little round skull, Northern Europeans and so on. Some Africans are brachiocephalic, round heads, and some are long heads, so there's nothing, I don't know what race has to do with it. It's just that parts of the world seem to have these qualities. Short and long skulls. It's best to not over-model this. Just get the clay and the glue in place, leave it alone. The next day you can cut it down or grind it or whatever it is. But we do need to raise the back of the skull. When we look at the photograph, you see how high the pitch of the head is before it begins to come down. The hair is probably this thick, but his head goes up there, so we want to have a suggestion of that on our model here. A little bit of glue, just in case the layers of clay are not properly joined with water, then we don't want them to separate. Now we're going to put a bit of clay on the top. In the moving picture business, a large head is more photogenic than a little tiny one. So men and women with small heads don't apply. You won't get anywhere in the industry. You have to have a large head and preferably a hairy one. That applies to both male and female. Women with heavy eyebrows and lots of head hair you can do things with. Eyelashes, terribly important. Men the same. Men with beards, because once in a while you need a roll with a beard. You have to grow a beard. If you don't have any beard, you have to wear a false one. Head hair is important. You may not have hair elsewhere, but on the head it's important. When you study the shape of skulls, you will see they have very distinct contours. Again, it's general, and each individual is slightly different, but there are certain general patterns to the skull. And frequently you'll see that this is the high point of the skull, here at the back. We may want to taper this slightly before we're done, but for now that'll have to do. I think this is sufficient as far as we want to go at this phase. The next stage will be something a little different. We want this to dry and get firm before we go any further